The U.S. didn't run out of land. So why did housing stop being built? The United States didn't suddenly run out of land. We didn't forget how to build houses. Construction companies didn't lose the ability to pour concrete or frame walls. And yet, for decades, housing construction has failed to keep up with population growth. So the real question isn't why homes are expensive. It's why so few are allowed to be built in the first place. To answer that question, we have to start by removing the most common misconception. Because the housing crisis didn't begin with a lack of land. It began with something far less visible. It's not a land problem, it's a permission problem. The United States didn't suddenly run out of land. There are still millions of acres that remain undeveloped across the country. So when people say housing became unaffordable because there's not enough space, that explanation doesn't really hold up. America isn't a crowded country. Compared to most developed nations, population density in the U.S. is relatively low. And yet, housing shortages are most severe in the same places over and over again. Near jobs, near infrastructure, near economic opportunity. That's the first clue that this isn't a land problem. Because the real issue isn't whether land exists, it's whether housing is allowed to be built on it. In many U.S. cities, owning land doesn't mean you can freely build homes. Zoning rules limit how many units are allowed, how tall buildings can be, and even what kind of households those homes are meant for. In some areas, entire neighborhoods are legally restricted to single-family homes only. No duplexes, no small apartment buildings, no added density, even as demand keeps rising. So while land technically exists, usable land is artificially limited. This is why construction didn't slow down because builders forgot how to build, and it's not because America lost the materials or the workers. Housing stopped being built at scale because the system made it harder, slower, and more expensive to get permission. Every additional rule adds time. Every delay adds cost, and every restriction reduces the number of homes that can actually be completed. Over time, that compounds. Housing didn't become scarce due to geography. It became scarce due to regulation. And once you understand that, the housing crisis starts to look very different. Because the question is no longer, where did all the land go? It becomes, who decides what gets built and who doesn't? And that's where the real story begins. When building slowed, the turning point no one talks about. For most of the 20th century, the United States built housing at a remarkable pace. As population grew, supply generally kept up. In fact, from the end of World War II through the late 1960s, housing construction expanded alongside economic growth. More people meant more homes. That relationship was relatively stable. But something changed in the early 1970s. If you look at the data, housing construction per capita peaked around that time, and then began a long, steady decline. Not a collapse overnight, but a structural slowdown that never fully reversed. What makes this shift so important is that population growth didn't stop. Jobs didn't disappear. Cities kept expanding. Yet new housing stopped keeping pace. At first, the gap was easy to ignore. Existing neighborhoods absorbed demand. Prices adjusted gradually. But decade after decade, the shortage compounded. So what happened? It wasn't that Americans suddenly stopped needing homes, and it wasn't that builders lost the ability to build efficiently. The real shift was institutional. Local governments began asserting far more control over what could be built, where it could be built, and who it was for. Zoning rules became more restrictive. Approval processes became longer and more uncertain. At the same time, existing homeowners gained more influence over development decisions. Preserving neighborhood character became a political priority. And while each individual rule may have seemed reasonable in isolation, together they fundamentally changed the system. Housing went from something you built by default to something you had to fight to get approved. That distinction matters because when supply becomes conditional, it no longer responds naturally to demand. Instead of building more when prices rise, the system resists change. And over time, that resistance turns into scarcity. This is why housing shortages today aren't random. They're concentrated in places that adopted the most restrictive systems decades ago. And once those systems were in place, reversing them became extremely difficult, because by then, high prices were no longer seen as a warning sign. They were seen as proof of success. Zoning, the rules that froze housing supply. When people hear the word zoning, it sounds technical, dry, bureaucratic. But zoning might be the single most important reason housing stopped being built where it's needed most. At its core, zoning decides one simple thing: what can be built on a piece of land? And in much of the United States, the answer is surprisingly limited. Large portions of American cities are legally restricted to single-family homes only. That means no duplexes, no triplexes, no small apartment buildings, even in areas close to jobs, transit, and schools. In other words, even as demand rises, density is locked in place. This didn't happen by accident. Single-family zoning expanded rapidly throughout the mid-20th century, especially after World War II. At the time, it was promoted as a way to create stability, protect property values, and separate residential areas from industrial ones. But over time, it did something else. It capped supply. When demand increases in a flexible system, builders respond by adding more units. Prices stabilize. Growth continues. But when zoning limits how many homes can exist in an area, higher demand has only one outlet: higher prices. That's why the most expensive housing markets in the U.S. are often the ones with the strictest zoning rules. Not because they're out of land, but because they've chosen not to use it. And zoning doesn't just restrict what can be built. It also affects how long it takes. Even projects that technically comply with local rules can take years to get approved. Public hearings, environmental reviews, appeals, delays. Each step adds cost and uncertainty, so developers respond rationally. Instead of building modest, lower-margin housing, they focus on larger, more expensive projects that can justify the risk. Smaller, incremental housing simply stops making sense. This is how the missing middle disappears. Duplexes, townhomes, small apartment buildings. Housing types that once made cities affordable are gradually regulated out of existence. And once that happens, supply becomes rigid. Prices rise faster. Rents follow. And affordability deteriorates, even if population growth is modest. What makes zoning especially powerful is that it operates quietly. There's no single law to point to, no dramatic moment where housing construction officially stopped. Instead, it slowed through thousands of small decisions made locally over decades. And by the time the consequences became obvious, the rules were deeply entrenched. Because for many homeowners, zoning works. High prices feel like success. Scarcity feels like stability. But for everyone else, the system does exactly what it was designed to do. It limits supply and pushes housing further out of reach. The hidden costs of restricting housing supply. When housing supply is restricted, the first impact people notice is price. Homes become more expensive. Rents go up. But price is only the most visible symptom. The deeper costs show up quietly, over time, across the entire economy. Because when housing can't be built where jobs are, people are forced to adapt in inefficient ways. They move farther away. They commute longer. They spend a larger share of their income just to live near opportunity. In many major U.S. metro areas today, housing costs consume over 30% of household income. For renters, that number is often much higher. This isn't just a personal budgeting issue, it's an economic drag. When workers can't afford to live near productive job centers, labor markets become less flexible. Businesses struggle to hire. Wages rise, not because productivity improved, but because housing costs did. That cost is then passed on to consumers. So housing scarcity doesn't just affect homeowners and renters, it feeds directly into inflation. There's also a geographic cost. As housing near city centers becomes scarce, development pushes outward. Suburbs sprawl farther. Commutes grow longer. Americans now spend significantly more time traveling to work than previous generations did, not because cities grew naturally, but because housing was prevented from growing inward. Longer commutes mean higher transportation costs, more congestion, and higher emissions. It also means less time with family, less time for rest, less flexibility in daily life. These are costs that never show up on a housing price chart, but they shape quality of life. Then there's the impact on who gets to stay. When supply is limited, housing stops being allocated by need and starts being allocated by wealth. Long-time residents are priced out. Younger households delay forming families. Lower-income workers are pushed farther away. This is how cities lose economic diversity, not overnight, but gradually. And the irony is that many of these outcomes are framed as market failures when they are actually policy outcomes. The market is doing exactly what it's allowed to do. Which brings us to builders. When supply is constrained, developers don't respond by building less efficiently. They respond rationally. If it takes years to get approval and millions in upfront cost, small projects stop making sense. Incremental housing disappears. Instead, builders concentrate on large, high-end developments where margins can absorb the risk. This is why new housing so often feels out of reach, not because builders prefer luxury, but because the system rewards it. Affordable housing becomes the exception, not the norm. And over time, the entire pipeline skews upward. Fewer entry-level homes, fewer modest apartments, more pressure at the bottom of the market. All of this stems from the same constraint: limited supply in the places demand is strongest. So when people ask why housing feels so broken today, the answer isn't just that prices went up, it's that a chain reaction was set in motion decades ago. Restricted supply led to higher prices reshaped behavior, and those behaviors compounded the problem even further. And once that cycle starts, it becomes very hard to stop. Who really benefits from housing scarcity? When housing becomes scarce, it's often framed as a failure of the market. Something went wrong. Something unexpected happened. But scarcity doesn't affect everyone equally. In fact, when housing supply is tightly restricted, there are clear winners, and they're not always obvious. Start with existing homeowners. If you already own a home in a supply-constrained market, rising prices feel like success. Your equity grows, your net worth increases, often without you doing anything differently. Scarcity turns housing from shelter into a financial asset. And for many households, that asset becomes their primary source of wealth. This creates a powerful incentive to maintain the status quo, because new housing doesn't just add neighbors, it adds competition. More supply can slow price growth, and slower price growth feels like a loss, even if values don't fall. So policies that restrict building often gain quiet support from those who benefit most from scarcity, not because they want to hurt others, but because the system rewards them for protecting what they already have. Then there are local governments.
In many cities, high property values expand the tax base without requiring significant changes to infrastructure. Fewer new residents means less strain on schools, roads, and services. From a short-term fiscal perspective, restricting growth can look efficient. High-value homes generate revenue, while limited development reduces complexity. But this comes at a long-term cost, one that doesn't always show up on municipal balance sheets. Next, consider incumbent property owners beyond homeowners. Landlords in constrained markets benefit from rising rents. Commercial property owners see higher demand for limited space. Even parking structures and storage facilities gain value when land becomes scarce. Scarcity raises the floor for everyone who already controls space, and that dynamic reshapes who has influence. When housing is abundant, no single group can easily dominate outcomes. But when supply is fixed, control over land becomes leverage. That leverage translates into political power. Local planning meetings are rarely dominated by people who don't yet live there. Future residents don't get a vote. Renters often lack the same influence as owners, so decisions about housing are disproportionately shaped by those who benefit from keeping things exactly as they are. This is how well-intentioned rules become self-reinforcing. Each new restriction slightly raises prices. Higher prices increase opposition to change. Opposition to change leads to even tighter constraints. Over time, scarcity becomes normalized. High prices stop being a warning sign. They're rebranded as proof of desirability.
And once that mindset takes hold, the conversation shifts. Instead of asking why housing is expensive, people ask who deserves to live there. Instead of expanding access, cities manage exclusion. This is where housing stops functioning like a normal good. In a typical market, high prices attract more supply. In housing, high prices often trigger more resistance. That inversion is critical because it means the system doesn't self-correct. Builders can't simply respond to demand. Workers can't easily move closer to opportunity. Younger generations face barriers their parents never did. And yet, from the perspective of those who benefit, the system appears to be working. Neighborhoods remain stable. Property values rise. Change is minimized. The cost is just displaced, pushed onto others, onto renters paying a larger share of their income, onto workers commuting longer distances, onto cities losing diversity and economic mobility. Housing scarcity doesn't eliminate demand, it redistributes pain. And the longer it persists, the more entrenched the beneficiaries become. Which is why fixing the housing crisis isn't just a technical challenge, it's a political one. Because any meaningful increase in supply threatens the advantages scarcity created. And that's the tension at the heart of the issue. The people who are most harmed by housing shortages often have the least power to change them, and the people who benefit most from scarcity often don't see a reason to. Understanding that dynamic is uncomfortable, but without it, the housing crisis can't be fully explained, and it certainly can't be solved.
Can this be reversed, or is this the new normal? After everything we've covered, the housing crisis starts to look very different. It wasn't caused by a sudden surge in population. It wasn't caused by a lack of land. And it wasn't caused by builders simply choosing not to build. It was shaped by decades of decisions that gradually restricted supply in the places demand grew the fastest. Once those constraints were in place, the system stopped responding naturally. High prices no longer triggered more housing, they triggered resistance. So the real question now isn't whether housing is broken, it's whether the system is capable of changing course. In theory, the solution seems straightforward. Allow more housing to be built where people want to live. But in practice, that's where things get complicated. Because housing policy in the United States is overwhelmingly local. Zoning decisions are made city by city, neighborhood by neighborhood, and the incentives at that level don't always align with broader economic needs. For individual homeowners, rising prices feel like security. For local governments, restricted growth can feel manageable. For existing residents, change feels risky. Meanwhile, the costs of scarcity are diffuse. They fall on renters, future residents, young households, and workers who don't yet live there. That imbalance makes reform slow. Even when cities acknowledge the problem, change often comes incrementally. A few units here, a small upzoning there. Enough to signal progress, but rarely enough to meaningfully shift supply.
And that raises a critical possibility. What if this isn't a temporary crisis? What if high housing costs are no longer a phase, but a feature? In many major U.S. metro areas, prices never fully reset after previous downturns. They plateau, they stabilize, and then they continue climbing from a higher base. That pattern suggests something structural. When supply is permanently constrained, even market corrections have limits. Demand may cool, prices may soften, but without new housing, affordability doesn't truly recover. This has long-term consequences. Home ownership becomes increasingly delayed. Household formation slows. Economic mobility declines. Where you're born starts to matter more than how hard you work, and cities that once thrived on openness begin to narrow. There's also a broader economic risk. When labor can't move freely to productive regions, growth slows. Innovation clusters become less accessible. Inequality widens, not just between people, but between places. Over time, this reshapes the entire economy. Some regions become locked into prosperity, others are locked out, and housing is the gatekeeper. The uncomfortable reality is that none of this requires a dramatic collapse to be damaging. The system can remain stable and still be deeply dysfunctional. Prices don't have to crash for housing to fail its purpose. They just have to stay out of reach. That's why debates about housing often feel stuck. Everyone agrees affordability is a problem. But solutions threaten interests that are already embedded, so progress tends to be slow, fragmented, and politically fragile. Which brings us back to the original question. The U.S. didn't run out of land. It ran into limits it imposed on itself. Whether those limits can be loosened or whether they harden further will shape the next generation's access to opportunity. Because housing isn't just about shelter. It's about who gets to live where, who gets to move, and who gets left behind. And as long as supply remains constrained, those questions won't go away. They'll just become more expensive. If you found this breakdown useful, it helps the channel more than you might think when you leave a like. It tells the algorithm this kind of long-form analysis is worth sharing. And if you want more videos like this, focused on data, structure, and long-term trends, consider subscribing. New videos come out regularly, and subscribing makes sure you don't miss them. If you disagree with anything in this video, or think there's an angle we didn't cover, feel free to leave a comment. Thoughtful discussions tend to surface insights that don't always make it into the video itself. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.